I guess we should do first an introduction. So, Purav, you know a little bit about us, right? So, the big question is, who are you? And
Yeah,
what is your expertise?
yeah, thanks, Justine and Anna, for having me on this user group. It's been great to see how the user group has developed over the last few months, and I'm proud to be on the show. So thank you. So I'm Purav Desai. I'm based in London. My expertise is around Microsoft security, but specifically since 2023, I've really taken on Purview and specifically Purview Audit and Purview e-discovery. So I would say that's my expertise within Purview. But I have over 6 years experience across the whole sort of stack. So, Defender, Sentinel, and Azure security as well. And I actively kind of contribute content back to the community around Microsoft security. And I'm an MVP as well. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
I have to say that I do know some MVPs in Purview, right? And most of them are into information protection or in data lifecycle management. But I haven't heard that much people being interested in auditing. But you are like really into it. So uh, explain a little bit, what is it and why is it so important and why did it attract you?
Yeah, I think it all started when I began a role as an incident responder, right? I work for a financial services organization at the moment. And incident response, right, apart from just, like neutralizing the threat, containing it, remediating it, you really need to kind of understand the forensics behind it, like the logs and how to interpret them. And so like very quickly into it, I got questions from like my manager, my director, like, oh, what is this like operation in the UAL like telling us? Like, what is this ID, like this random GUID string and all of that, right? And it just made me think like on the back end, there must be a way to kind of make sense of this GUID, right? There must be a friendly name or something. And then that's what led me to start my Deciphering UAL GitHub series, which hopefully we can link to in the description. But basically that's kind of helping you to make sense of those GUIDs, right? So deciphering them into friendly names. And then basically when I started drilling more into those operations, I was like, there's not much content in the community about this. Like if you have like a file download event, what are the fields that you would care about from the operation? Like you'd care about who did the download, what the object ID of the file was, when they did it, what IP address they did it from. All of those kind of like forensic artifacts weren't there. And also the operations that had those random GUIDs just had no documentation on how to decipher them. And then very quickly, I kind of learned that through Exchange PowerShell and a few other things, you could make sense of them. And I just started contributing content, and yeah, people really liked it. And then I started the GitHub series, and it's been a bit abandoned since 2023. I need to pick it up again. But yeah, that's kind of become my niche now. Some people have given me a nickname of Prince of Auditing and Dr. Purview and all this. Um,
That's a
but
Purview. Oh, right. I love that one.
but yeah, so I think auditing is kind of maybe underappreciated, I suppose, maybe in the Purview space, but ultimately any action you make in Purview or even in Defender now will be audited, right? So you can always check like what you did to govern it and make sure it's done correctly. And why it's really helpful is because of, Tattoo session yesterday, for example. I'm not sure when this will come out. So the November session that Tattoo did around insider risk, right? You want to be able to audit that activity because if an insider risk did something dodgy, you need to gather
Mhm.
those forensics to then take the necessary, actions. So yeah, for me, auditing has become my speciality, rightly or wrongly, for the last 2 years. But Justine, as I was telling you before the course started, right, I didn't even know Purview existed prior to 2023. So becoming an SME, close to SME, and e-discovery and audit within 2 years has been a fun learning curve, and I'm just glad that my content is adding value to people.
Yeah, yeah, cool. Yeah, so for me, the auditing um, a solution, it feels so abstract, right?
Mm.
So how was that for you to work with that? Is it something that is familiar to you, you like to work with, or did it take some time to get used to it and how yeah how you work with it and get the results you want or the answers you want?
Yeah, it definitely took a while to figure it out because the way the auditing is structured, right, you have different like record types. So, for example, Exchange could have like Exchange item as a record type, Exchange admin as a record type. All those are like record types, and I don't know the actual definition of a record type, but you can think of it kind of a group of events tied to a particular service in M365, right? So there's not only record types, then you have workloads. So you could have like a workload of Exchange, workload of Teams. Then you have operations. So operations would be like your file downloaded, file accessed, all those things would be operations. So kind of tying those things together initially was very difficult. And the best way that I kind of took that challenge on to figure it out was just look at my activity. Because I knew that, for example, I uploaded a file to SharePoint. Okay, there'll be a file upload event. I can then correlate that to the time that I uploaded it. I can correlate that to the IP address I performed that from. I can correlate that to the file name that I uploaded. And then slowly, just looking at my own activity allowed me to see, oh, this is how SharePoint events kind of work. This is how Exchange events work. This is how Teams events work. So that's what I would encourage anyone that's kind of daunted by this prospect of diving into auditing, because it is quite a maze to navigate. Just look at your own activity, and then you'll kind of make sense of those operations and events and record types as well. But yeah, it is definitely a steep learning curve. The documentation only goes so far into a few specific scenarios, but you really should, you will naturally perform activities in M365, right? All of us are obviously using Teams, Exchange, SharePoint. So as you perform those activities, dive into the auditing to see how is what you're doing being logged. And that's the best advice I can give.
Yeah, it's a great tip. Anna, did you do that before? Did that before?
I
I
well,
didn't.
so I have a dev tenant in which the limitation is the amount of users, right? It's just me generating these audits. But I think that's such a great tip for anybody who has access to this data to start learning about auditing. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, Purav, is there's so much insight to gain from auditing, but there's also so many different ways to gain that insight. You can go to the unified audit log within Purview. The different Purview solutions have their own type of alerting capability, their activity explorers. And then there's the entire world of Sentinel and all these different themes that you can roll up these insights into. So what has your experience been like with all of these different solutions, capabilities, tools, and do you have any, I would say, best practices or ways that you go about auditing given everything that you have available to you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say it depends on the scenario with the time frame. So what I mean specifically is, let's say you're investigating events for a user in your tenant within the last 30 days. Then it makes the most sense to just do it within the Cloud App Events table, within Defender or within Sentinel, because that data is going to be like hot data, like you can consume it quickly through the queries. You can apply granular filters, if you want specific hidden conditions, like in the Purview sort of audit experience, right? If you're familiar with the audit search page, there's only limited filters you can apply, like record type, operation. But what if you have a very bespoke property, like sensitivity label ID, for example? You can't apply that property within the GUI. So things like that, you'd have to then pivot over to Sentinel or Cloud App Events within Defender. And the power there is obviously naturally it's 30 days retention. You can extend it for longer, but most companies may or may not. So assuming you go with the default, then if you're trying to investigate activities within 30 days, I would strongly recommend looking at the Cloud App Events table within Defender or Sentinel. Where the Purview audit sort of search capability comes in handy is events older than that, because by default with an E5 license, you can retain records up to a year. With an E3 license, it's 180 days from 90 days previously. Um, and with that 1 year, right, you're retaining the main workloads. So what we touched on earlier, the key workloads would be SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, Teams, and they also include Azure AD in that as a retention as well. So those events would be captured for up to a year. And you can then basically, apply custom retention, audit log retention policies to retain it for even longer. But if you're trying to investigate activities older than 30 days, then and you're not retaining for longer natively within Defender or Sentinel, then you'd have to use the Purview audit search, to get those events back. The problem there, though, is the filtering, so what I mentioned, right? So the way I've found to kind of tackle that is you would have to do the Purview audit search within the Purview portal, export it to CSV, and then use Power Query or something to basically parse out those fields, because If you've looked at the CSV, it basically gives you 3 columns, and the last column is audit data. And audit data is your JSON object with all those other properties that you need. And there isn't an easy way to pass it out apart from using Power Query. Maybe in the future we'll have like audit for Copilot or Copilot for audit or something, right? Where we can just tell it, hey, I only want these, field names and for these operations, and it can do it for you. But for now, we basically have to use those manual tricks. So that's what I found. So to summarize, right, if you're within 30 days investigations, go to the Cloud App Events table where you can be really granular in your queries and get the most value that you want. Any longer than 30 days, you're probably better off using the Purview audit search, and then you'd export to CSV and then manipulate that CSV through Power Query to filter and get to what you need.
What do you see most? I feel like not many organizations are on time. At least the organizations that don't have their security in place yet. That's also why all the numbers are that organizations will find their data leakage in 300 days. And I feel like, wow, how is it possible that you find out that late? Do you see that happen as well? Because there's, of course, that difference between, I can look into Cloud Apps for the 30 days, or I need audit logs to see what happened with a user, for example.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it depends. So again, if you have like custom detections to match on a particular behavior, that behavior would then trigger an alert as soon as it occurs. So you'd be within, that 30-day period. But
Yeah.
what if later on you find a suspicion that, this user that left like last week did something 3 months ago? Then you'd have to go to the audit search. Based on kind of what I've seen across industry, yeah, it really it can vary. I think dwell time, the time that an attacker will lie in your tenant undetected can be like 300 days. So what you said earlier is like akin to that, right? So with that in mind, that there can be, cases where you catch it much later. The only thing I could say to that is start proactively thinking about how long you want to retain those logs for. Because if you're only retaining the default workloads, now for a year, let's say, start thinking proactively about, hey, we should really look to do some custom audit log retention policies to retain for longer. That won't help you right now, but you never. Oh, that's okay.
Sorry.
But you never know in you never know in future. Like for example, if 5 years from now you needed something from 2025, then if you've retained those logs for that long since today, then you would benefit from those, right? It's kind of like you have to apply it now to then benefit from it in the future, if that makes sense. If you haven't applied it from now and you need to go back more than a year and you don't have that retention, you're kind of stuffed because there is no way to retrieve those logs. Like Microsoft won't keep them, they're not in your tenant, and if you're not offloading them to any other source for long-term retention, you're basically screwed, unfortunately. But you can take that as a lesson to think proactively to say, how long should we be retaining for, and start considering those audit log retention policies to retain for longer.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point to proactively look at what needs to be retained. But I'd love to get your insight into how organizations can prioritize that, because there is just essentially the audit raises every activity that your users are doing, and it can be a lot. So how would you go about prioritizing what's retained?
Yeah, I would say focus on the main workloads, critical workloads, right? So by default, as I mentioned, Exchange, OneDrive, Teams, SharePoint, and Azure AD are recorded for a year. So if you just want to do a little bit of maturity from that, right, create a custom audit log retention policy, scope it to just those workloads, and maybe increase the retention to 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, up to 10 years, right, with an additional license. But as you mature, start looking at what other workloads you really care about. For example, you touched on Purview alerting earlier, right? So the DLP compliance and SharePoint record type or workload, one of them, I can't remember, but the kind of the aggregator that captures all those events, then look to maybe add that as a secondary custom audit log retention policy, or scope that into your your previous custom audit log retention policy, right? So you can kind of like, the crawl, walk, run approach. The crawl would be retain the critical workloads that your business deems worthy, which in my opinion would be Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams, and Azure AD. But obviously, if you have others that you critically care about, scope that into your initial policy. And if you don't, then in the phase 2, as part of the walk approach, start looking at what other workloads do we actually care about that we want to retain longer, which could help us in incidents. The ones I've seen that work well across industry could be, like DLP alerts, compliance DLP SharePoint. Also, for example, sensitivity label activities. We touched on Activity Explorer earlier. If someone classifies a file with a label and then later downgrades the label to try and evade detection or exfiltrate that data, those logs would be in a separate workload to the SharePoint workload, right? I think it's called AIP Sensitivity Label Action, record type 94, something like that, I think, off the top of my memory. So you could then prioritize that within your custom audit log retention policy to say, hey, we want to retain these records as well, for the next 3, 5, 7, up to 10 years. So it's very much like a crawl, walk, run approach, right? So as you mature and as you get better understanding of what you actually care about as a business, which could be influenced by the sort of attacks you've seen or any incidents you've seen, take like inventory, right? Sorry, I'm kind of going on tangents here and there, but I'll
No
summarize at the
worries.
end.
We just want to get the information, so let's keep it going.
Okay, so let's say like you take inventory, right? At the end of the year, we had incidents across all these different workloads. These are the logs that we care about, etc. Great. Then you've identified a point for improvement in the next year. You can say, okay, now we want to improve the custom audit log retention policy. I wish there was a shorter form for that, but you could improve that policy to basically then scope in those workloads, right? And like I said, the ones that I've seen work well are the DLP alerting ones, the compliance SharePoint ones, and specifically the sensitivity label action ones. Because all those signals can really help you determine what an attacker did if you're catching it in the future. But ideally, you should have DLP and also IRM to prevent that activity before the damage is done, right? But organizations are on a maturity journey, as I like to say. So some people barely have sensitivity labels figured out. They haven't really got DLP. They haven't even thought about IRM. So they're often catching this later, to your point, Justine, right? So if you have those logs, you can at least rewind back in time and say, oh, this attacker or this insider threat did downgrade the label. And here's the event from 2 years ago that we can see them downgrading. We can see the justification they put for that downgrade was just, blah or nonsense or whatever, like something useless entirely. So it clearly wasn't a business process. And they clearly did that to circumvent controls and do damage to the organization. So hopefully in a whirlwind way that helps, right, Anna? So crawl, walk, run, prioritize the critical workloads to your business, whatever that is. That should definitely encompass the 5 key workloads, SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive, Teams, Azure AD, but also if there's any others that you prioritize. Then when you move to the walk phase, take inventory of the attacks and incidents you've had, identify the workloads and record types that you didn't scope in your policy, and consider scoping them in the next time. And then the run approach would just be, improving the preventative measures. So you're retaining logs, but ideally you're preventing the damage by maturing your DLP and maturing your IRM as well. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Yes, it does. That breakdown was amazing. Thank you for providing that. When you were talking about all of the different workloads that came to mind was that, those workloads aren't in a silo. And to have a comprehensive view and approach to security, we need to be able to correlate the different insights that we get across these workloads. So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say when you filter the activity initially, right? So let's say you have user A did some dodgy activity between date A and date B, or date B and date C, right? So then you should gather all the activities that user did. And then what I like to do is kind of, you basically footprint them, right? I think that's the term for it. So you look at like what operations or activities they've done within that period of interest. So you could see like at high level, in Exchange, they've sent an email, they've I don't know, created an inbox rule. Within Teams, they've sent a message, they've reacted to a message, they've added someone to a channel. Within SharePoint, you've seen they've uploaded a file, they've classified a file, they've added someone to a SharePoint site, and all those kind of things will then help you to basically pitch the time picture what am I trying to say? Picture the timeline. So you can then categorically say, like, from point A to point B, this is all they did, and across these workloads, this is what I care about. You won't be able to correlate like the actual event. Like, for example, someone sending an email in exchange on day one and then adding someone to a channel in day two isn't directly correlatable, if that's a word. But what it could help you identify later is to say, okay, this person did this activity in exchange to basically inform someone that they were going to do this, right? Like collusion. We often see, in industry that people could collude as insider threats. So it's not just one insider threat. Maybe they're planning to do damage as a group. Maybe they're all being laid off or something, right? So insider threat one communicates to insider threat two via exchange. So that could be like your initial kind of activity. And then the day later, you find out that insider threat one added insider threat two to a sensitive SharePoint site, which insider threat two shouldn't have had access to. So then you can start correlating a little bit to say, across this period of interest, we see insider threat one not only trying to gather the troops, as it were, by informing insider threat two, but they're also now adding insider threat two to give insider threat two visibility into sensitive content, right? So that's the best way I can answer to correlate, because you won't be able to kind of tie those events together. There won't be a unique ID across both those events because there's nothing really tying them together. But what ties them together after the fact is maybe the motive or maybe the sequence of events that then lead to a disaster. Certain events you can correlate better. For example, sensitivity label. If someone sends an email with a sensitivity label and then they downgrade the sensitivity label for that file, you would get the object ID, which would tie both those events together. And you would also get the sensitivity label ID present in both, which would show the label that they used when they sent the email, but also the old label when they downgraded it. So you'd see the old label as well as the new label ID. So those two things could be more easily correlated, but that's within the same workload of AIP sensitivity label action. You can't, to answer your question, you can't directly correlate across workloads, but those signals across the different workloads can help you to tell a true picture and story after the fact as part of your investigation. Yeah, that's the best way I can answer that.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And it almost makes me feel that that's an amazing use case for something like a Copilot for audit, like you mentioned, that
Yeah.
can help to correlate that, because that's a very intensive task to go ahead and notice all these little details that would correlate these different alerts.
Yeah, because like you said, there's like hundreds of events, right? So what I do, like with the footprint thing that I mentioned, right? You look for any interesting operations. Like if it's just file access, yeah, you could skim through the object IDs and say, okay, these files are just, company intranet pages or things like that. You don't really care about those. But if there's anything with any sensitive strings or anything, concerning like secret project names, etc., that could be worthy of basically highlighting. The way to think about this kind of as an approach, right, is in forensics, you kind of have a concept of like tag or bookmark notable evidence. So with the CSV, if you export it from Purview, you could start highlighting rows, right? Highlighting yellow or orange or whatever as a kind of a potential pivot point or potential point of interest. So when it comes to your kind of summary, when you have to write the incident report, you can just filter in Excel by that color, and then you've got all your points there, right? And you can easily then say, on this time, this user did this, and this is why it's of interest. Later on, this user did this, and this is why it's of interest. And all of that can help you contribute to the report. So yeah, definitely important to footprint the user, and that can help you make sense of the noise a little bit, because you can start ignoring, non-value adding operations, non-value adding events, and basically then filtering to the events of interest that you care about and that are going to help you tell the story from an incident response perspective. Yeah.
Cool. So, is there a case that you can share with us that surprised you or taught you something really unexpected?
Good question. I think, okay, yeah, I can give an example of a case that's happened in the past. So we saw a user basically using eDiscovery, right? So they were using eDiscovery to basically like exfiltrate data. We didn't know that at the time, but we learned this after the fact. And what it basically told us is they were creating cases at like a really unusual time, right? So they were, for example, logging in to the Purview portal at like 2 a.m., 3 a.m., something like that, right? Which is really
Yeah,
suspicious.
that's already like
Quite suspicious. Yeah.
alarm bells ringing, right? Yeah.
And at that time we weren't at that level of maturity where you could kind of have time enforced logins and things like this, right? So they were allowed to log in. And what they were doing is they were logging in and then basically doing just tenant-wide searches. I think back then they were doing content searches, so it wasn't even proper e-discovery. And they'd be looking for sensitive keywords like payment, wire, transfer, things like this, right? And they were basically then downloading that data and copying it to USB, and basically later we learned they were just exfiltrating it. But what it taught me was just how easy it would have been to prevent that. Like, I think the thing about the log on hours, I think is a key one. Like, why are people logging in? They should just be able to elevate the role for Purview within a certain time range that you deem business worthy. You shouldn't allow people to just go on the weekend or go on at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Right. So that was one thing. But the second thing that it taught me, and back then I wasn't as familiar with auditing, but I learned how the different operations of e-discovery help you tell that story. So we were able to see a case added operation. Then at the time, there was a custodian created operation where the user was adding people of interest that they wanted to search. They were doing a search created operation where they were then searching for those keywords, and we could see the keywords in the logs. And then finally, they were trying to close the case. But after that, they were deleting the case, because what they thought is that if they delete the case from Purview, no one will notice it, because when the Purview people go in, or back then it was Compliance Center, but when they go in, they wouldn't see any e-discovery or content searches. But what they didn't realize, or what we learned afterwards, is there is an audit event of search removed or case removed right now, which then shows you this case ID was actually deleted. So it taught me quite a few things about how people can try and evade detection and do things contrary to the baseline of performing duties within work hours. Um, and then obviously, copying to USB, we matured our sort of DLP posture back then to prevent USB activity and all of that. But I think the thing that just really struck me back then was the fact that someone tried to delete their case to evade detection, but the log still caught them. And again, it goes back to what you said earlier about auditing and why people should take it seriously, and all of that is, this can help you identify events where people have tried to evade detection and basically hide their tracks, right? So I think that's something that really resonated with me and has stuck with me since. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really nice a case you shared.
Yeah, one of the things that fascinates me about auditing, and I think the case that you just shared brings it out, is that when you are an expert in auditing, you're not tied to a particular solution, whether it be discovery, whether it be information protection, data loss prevention. Um, and that's very cool because you're going across different teams and organizations, but really the concepts of auditing are still the same. But I guess my question for you is how do you see like a typical breakdown of the roles and responsibilities for auditing within an organization because it spans across all of these different types of solutions?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because by default, if someone is added to the Purview Audit Radar role group within Purview, right, they can do searches across the whole of the unified audit log, depending on the retention. So if you have 1 year, they can see everything that's happened in your tenant for the last 1 year. Microsoft is getting better at that, but they're doing it more from a Graph API perspective. So through Graph API, you can basically do those audit searches, because let's say, in the portal, you may have human error, someone may put in the wrong date criteria, etc. So you may want to, as you mature, script it, right? So you can do that through Graph API. And what they've done with the Graph API permission specifically is you can actually do granular permissions to the workloads. So you could have, for example, and I'm not as familiar with this. I'm kind of going off the documentation and my own testing and my demo tenant and all of that a little bit. But from what I understand, you could have an app registration, which is an app in your Entra tenant, with a Graph API permission of whatever it's called, like audit log dot, and then audit log dot OneDrive dot read dot all. And that way, people can only query the OneDrive workload within the unified audit log. But what that means is that anyone going to the Purview portal could still do it. So the solution there is to not give that person permissions to the Purview portal, have them do it through PowerShell, right? Or ideally have an automation account which runs it on their behalf and just gives them the output. Then that way they're only seeing the OneDrive data. So to answer your question, typically I would say most security operation folks would want to see everything across the tenant. But if you're in a very regulated environment, there might be certain country restrictions, there might be certain duties where only certain investigators should see OneDrive and certain investigators should see Exchange, things like that. You can then start adopting the mature approach, which is to remove the Purview permissions, but look at the Graph API options and then have multiple app registrations per workload. So one could be auditlog.onedrive.read.all, and one could be auditlog.sharepoint.read.all. Another one could be auditlog.exchange.read.all, and then basically have those automations triggered based on the investigators that need them, whether they sign into the app reg and kick off the searches, or whether it's done automatically on their behalf through another SOAR platform like Logic Apps or Sentinel or something like that. Then that way you don't run the risk of them accidentally running into those issues, because even if they then specify, and again, I haven't tested this, but this is from my understanding of the documentation, even if they were to then do a search with a workload of Exchange, but their Graph API permission is scoped to OneDrive, they shouldn't, in theory, be able to retrieve those Exchange results. But I can try and test that in the next year and report back, maybe on a future session on this user group. But yeah, from what I understand, Microsoft has done a really good job of making it granular, but they've made it granular only through Graph API. So if you're giving people permissions through the Purview role group, which is usually the native and least effort approach, then people can by default search through across all the workloads. And maybe in your company that's fine, but as you mature and if you have certain regulations, I would highly encourage you to explore the Graph API options, which are far more granular. And it's good to see Microsoft offering that granularity, because that was only added, I think, earlier this year or late last year. So they clearly see a need for this, otherwise they wouldn't have rolled it out.
Yeah, well, it's a really good tip, I guess, for the more mature organizations to dive into that.
Yeah, for sure. But the only caveat there is if you have like one app reg for one workload, make sure you have the other workloads covered, because you don't want to be in a position where you've removed everyone's Purview permissions and you've only got an app reg to OneDrive. What if you then need to get Exchange data? So if you do go with the Graph API approach, make sure that you have those permissions across those key workloads that I mentioned, right? SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, and Teams at the minimum. But it also may cause, I don't know if both of you are thinking this way, but I touched on earlier about scoping in additional workloads and record types in your policy. For now, Microsoft haven't offered a granular per workload approach for Graph API, apart from those key workloads that I mentioned. So for example, if you wanted someone to only search the AIP sensitivity label action record type, to see sensitivity label downgrades and things like that, you wouldn't be able to, from what I understand. But maybe that could be fed back through the community CCP and so on, and then they can look at that as a private preview. But for now, they're only focusing on the key workloads. So maybe to that point, you want to have a break glass kind of approach where you have someone that's trusted and vetted to the highest degree and all of these things, where they have full permissions in Purview. So they have the native Purview audit reader role, so they can always go into the tenant and pull that additional data if another investigator needs it, and they also have clearance to do so. Because last thing you want is, you only have an app reg for OneDrive, and then someone comes urgently with a request for Exchange. You've switched off all your Purview roles for audit, and then you're basically stuffed, right? Like you won't be able to get that audit log data, especially if it's more than 30 days. So yeah, just a couple of considerations there to keep in mind.
Yeah. I think we should go to the next theme because we're already so focused so much on
I was thinking
auditing.
this is the audit show. Yeah.
Yeah, it is the audit show. But you are also very into oversharing, right? And of course you can use the audit for that as well. But I think nowadays there are many companies that have to face oversharing since they want to use Copilot, and it's now like really in their face that most of the users have more access to data than organizations were actually expecting that they had. So how did you develop your knowledge on, okay, how can I find out how all the access is and how the oversharing is within an organization?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm actually doing a talk on this as part of the Festive Tech Calendar next month. So hopefully by the time this is up, that will be up, and then we can promote it. But yeah, shameless self plug. But in brief, right, I would say you really need to understand the SharePoint architecture, and this is something I didn't understand, so I kind of had to learn it myself. So in brief, without giving away too much from the talk, you can have kind of standalone SharePoint sites, and you can have group connected SharePoint sites. Now, what happens is, companies with a basic level of maturity, they may prevent external access. So you don't want like others to consume your SharePoint content, which is great. But like you mentioned, Justine, oversharing can occur within the company. Department A's data should only be seen by Department A. So what I learned through that kind of SharePoint architecture research piece is there's a default setting sometimes of company-wide access. Like if a SharePoint site is public, as Microsoft call it, it's not public to external, it's public to everyone across your company, right? So that's the first thing I would say. People should start looking, taking inventory again of what SharePoint sites do you have in the company, which ones are public, should they be public? If not, make them private. Because there might be some legitimate cases for public, right? For example, HR, for example, intranet, all these kind of sites should be public because they need to be accessed by all employees. But sensitive payroll, etc., should definitely not be public, right? So start taking inventory of those. And on the point of Copilot, and I only learned this recently, one Copilot license gives you access to SharePoint Advanced Management, which is kind of an add-on license for SharePoint. And what Microsoft have done is they allow you to basically vet your SharePoint sites, identify the SharePoint sites that are public, if they've been active, all these kind of like metadata properties, which can then help you determine if this SharePoint site should be made private, or if it's not even being used in a year, like let's just archive the data and kill it off. Like why do we even have that open as a potential attack vector, right?
Yeah.
So that would be my sort of starting point. Like take inventory of your existing SharePoint sites and identify the ones that are public and consider making them private or archive/delete them. Once you've done that, look at your group connected SharePoint sites. Okay, so group connected SharePoint sites are a bit more mature where they need to be part of or they are inherently part of an M365 group. And the permissions there are either, again, public or private. The concern there, though, is if it's public, not people can be added to it by default. They have to request to join it based on your sort of, actually, wait, let me rewind. If it's public, then anyone in your company can discover that M365 group and join it. If it's private, then they need to request to join it. So similarly, identify the M365 groups that are public in your tenant because they could have associated SharePoint sites. Most likely they do. And evaluate again if they should be public or should they be made private. So that would be step 2. And again, SharePoint Advanced Management helps you with that as well. In the report that I mentioned, I believe it kind of combines the standalone sites and the group connected sites. So that would be like step 1 and step 2. Then as you mature and sort of think about this more strategically, the report will also identify broken permission inheritance. Yeah, broken permission inheritance. So the way broken permission inheritance works, and again, this was all new to me, I had to dive deep into SharePoint architecture, is if, for example, you set at the site level that this is, private or public, someone can actually share a file within the site to someone else, and that share then basically changes the permissions on that file, thus breaking the inherited permissions. Because the way to think about it is if a site is set to private, Department A site is only seen by Department A. And then the site has a folder structure, right? So it will have like libraries and then files within that. If one of the members of Department A shares file B within that folder structure to user C, which is in Department Z, let's just say, so I don't confuse the letters,
Yeah.
then the file permissions are basically changed to now give visibility to that user in department Z. Thus, you've broken your SharePoint permission inheritance, because ideally what should happen is you should set it at the site level, and they shouldn't be able to then modify that. You can actually change that. So you can change the, site sharing options. And I only learned this recently thanks to Sarah Fenner in the community, so shout out to her. Where basically you can then restrict it so only the owners can share files within the site. So it kind of puts a dampener on collaboration, because we do want people to collaborate and share. But ideally, if a site is meant for department A, it should only be shared with department A, right? Across department A, user in department A can share with another user in department A, and that's the collaboration. But if there's no need for department A data to be seen by department Z, there shouldn't even be a sharing mechanism. So those would be like 3 top things I would say, in terms of like helping with oversharing. I think there is also an oversharing blueprint which Microsoft offer, which includes some of the things I've mentioned about the SharePoint advanced management features and all of that. But I would say a really easy lift for companies that are not as mature in their SharePoint architecture awareness and things like that is just start looking at the SharePoint Admin Center, look at the public sites and determine if they should be public. And if they're not, make them private, because that will reduce your blast radius immediately from a Copilot perspective. Yeah, so that's what I would say for now.
Yeah, I'm also wondering if you wouldn't get like an uncontrolled growth if you have like what you just mentioned, like if you have from department A, a user that wants to share with someone in Team Z, but it's only A, then you need another platform, right? Another a SharePoint to be able to share the document. So that's a difficult situation then. Would you
So
create a new SharePoint? What would be the best option
yeah,
for that? Do you have
it's a
any
good
ideas on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So let's say Department A needed to collaborate with Department C on a short-term basis, right? I think that's where you were going. So
Yeah.
you'd have to share files in that period for a limited time. What you could do is you could, if it's a group connected site, you'll have a team for that group, right? So within the team, you could create a shared channel. The shared channel benefit is that it creates a kind of a unique SharePoint site associated to that group and team. So the way it works is you could have like, company.my.sharepoint.com as a URL, right? /team/ let's just call it like department A. Okay. Then what will happen is if the shared channel says like dep A, dep C, just as a name, right? Then the URL of that SharePoint site associated to that SharePoint channel, shared channel
Yeah.
would be company.sharepoint.com/team/dep /department A dash dep A dep C. This is easier if I had those screenshots or whatever, but I'm
Yeah.
going off the cuff.
I can imagine.
So it would be the same as the team URL, but there would be a dash at the end of it, and then there would be the channel name. So that's what
Yeah.
uniquely identifies that SharePoint site. And then what you can do is once that project wraps up with Department C, you can archive that SharePoint site and all of that, because that way you're not running into the risk of them having been shared any data in Department A's main SharePoint site. This is almost like a secondary SharePoint site that spun up just in time to help with this Department C collaboration. Do you know what I mean? So that could be one approach. But you're right, because if you then collaborate with Department D, Department E, Department F, like how many shared channels are you having? I guess it would depend on your risk appetite, right? Because one thing you could do is you could just have Department A's main SharePoint site and then have a Department A collaborator's secondary SharePoint site. And you have to be aware that that Department A collaborators could include Department E, F, G, H, whatever, all the way up to Z, right? But a more mature approach would be doing granularly per department. And yes, that could overwhelm your team list and all of that. But I think from an auditing and risk compliance maturity perspective, it's probably better to do that, because once Department C project finishes, you can just archive that shared channel SharePoint site, you can purge that data, and then you're basically kind of minimizing the amount of active SharePoint sites you have as well. But if you don't want to do it that way, you could just have a main department SharePoint site and then a department collaborators SharePoint site. It is quite tricky because it's without proper configuration. I mean, like, question to the audience, maybe leave it as a comment, like, how many of you actually know what the sharing option is configured for the SharePoint sites you have? Like, are you able to break the SharePoint inheritance permissions like I mentioned, or are you not? Right? If you are, then clearly your company has to consider one of those two options, like Department A main, Department A collaborator secondary, or Department A main, Department A dash collaborator C dash collaborator D dash collaborator D, depending on a just-in-time basis. One of those two approaches could definitely help you, but I think most organizations have definitely overlooked the sharing option and the fact that it breaks permission inheritance. And it was new to me, right? As I was going through this kind of SharePoint architecture understanding piece, like, I thought, like, oh, surely you'd set it at the site level and then everything would just trickle down and it would make sense. And then when I learned about, oh, people can actually break permissions, it's like, oh, great. This is why we can't have nice things, right? Like, you enforce the controls from security perspective, and then user's going to use it and then change it. But like I said, there are controls that you can put in place to minimize that, but you would have to go in, each SharePoint site and sort of configure those as well to prevent users from sharing widely. So yeah, it's an ongoing battle, right? And I guess it keeps us people employed and keeps us people contributing content to the community. So yeah, thank you, Microsoft, I guess. Yeah.
I was hoping to lean into more of the behavioral aspect of oversharing. So as technical security people, we can put in place we can identify oversharing, remediate it, but I feel that sometimes we overlook the behavioral aspect that led to the oversharing in the first place. So what are your thoughts on some of the behaviors that can lead to oversharing, and how would you go about addressing that within an organization?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's almost like, what is the motive for oversharing? It's not something I've thought about, to be honest, but let me think about it practically. Like, if I was going to overshare, what would make me want to overshare? I suppose sometimes, like, you could run the risk of being too strict and too annoying, for lack of a better word, to your users, where then they become creative to try and just get basic tasks done. So an example off the top of my head, and this is a really out the ordinary example, so I don't know how realistic this is, but let's say you're planning a bonus incentive, okay, and for some reason you're doing it department by department, and maybe in January you're telling Department A about the bonus incentive, and you're planning to roll the bonus incentive out to the other departments throughout the rest of the year, but you ideally don't want Department A to tell the other departments that it's coming, because maybe there's a challenge you have to do to get this bonus incentive, right? Maybe there's some, I don't know, maths problem you have to solve. Maybe there's some UAO search you have to do, right, to identify what this user did in this particular time. I don't know, some sort of like security challenge or IT challenge, right? And you don't want people kind of knowing that challenge ahead of time and then sharing the answer, etc. What could lead to oversharing in that case, though, is, let's say user A in Department A is really good friends with user B in Department B. Maybe user B was the one that recruited user A, right? Maybe they referred them to the role. So if you think about it, user A is kind of indebted to user B, because without user B, they wouldn't have the job. So if anything, if there's an incentive where they're going to get a bonus, they would want to share it with user B, right? Again, I'm thinking out loud here, so this may be a completely fake situation. I don't know. I'm just making it up as I go along. It's a very
So people could
that
say if
question
this happens, you
that
can do
question
it
definitely thrown me.
anonymously.
Yeah, exactly, right. This is definitely not based on any real events. This is just me off the cuff. So maybe then user A would want to just share it to user B to say, hey, there's this bonus incentive coming. I really appreciate you for recruiting me for this role, referring me. Thanks to you, I'm in this position. I really enjoy this, blah, blah, blah. As a heads up, there will be this, department-based incentive coming. Here's the challenge you have to do to solve it. And if you do it quickly, you can get a higher bonus. Maybe that's something I forgot to mention as I'm thinking this aloud. As part of the bonus incentive, the first person to solve that challenge and apply the flag, like thinking about capture the flag or whatever, gets the highest amount, right? First, second, and third. Yeah, let's go with that. First, second, and third, right? So first person gets the maximum amount, second person gets the slightly less amount, and third person gets the even less amount. So user A wants to do a favor to user B because they're indebted to them and all that, to basically help them get the maximum bonus. So they would give them a heads up to say, this is the challenge, and maybe even help them with the answer. So that could be one behavior potentially
This
that
would
could lead to
definitely be a good
oversharing.
storyline for a movie or so.
Netflix series, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, what I also think why it happens is what you see now nowadays. Of course, the workload is quite high within organizations. So sometimes people from another department help others, and content is being shared it should be for a limited time, but it is shared once, and afterwards it won't be like cut back. And then you have this oversharing issue, or also when someone transfers from department A to department B and the access is still there, and only the person get more access and the access won't be removed, yeah, then you also have this oversharing issue. So
Yeah.
I think it happens more often than we think. And also, we just want to be productive, right? If someone else from another department needs some information from me and I have it in a document, I'll share that document. I want to give them the information as quickly as possible, and I'm not thinking at that moment about, okay, but what does this actually mean also for in the future? And if you don't have the settings like it is only being shared for 30 days or for 60 days, yeah, then you have unlimited access to a file, for example. If you don't have the default for that is for only a few days or months, so to say. So yeah, that is quite interesting, I guess, that oversharing happens so quickly, could happen so quickly.
Yeah, on that point, I love the fact that they've added the expiration time for a sharing link. I think that's a really great
Same.
feature. Because prior to that, like you said, it would just be persistent access, right? And I think I agree with you as well in terms of like the workload and just getting the job done. Like people just sometimes they're not even doing it maliciously, like you said, like they just want to help someone out to say, here's a document with this information, but they just and it's hard to know like what constitutes legitimate goodwill versus intentional / malicious, right?
Yeah. And I think we also have to keep in mind that like we are into this topic like every day, right? But others are not. They're not like focused and all the time aware about, okay, if I'm sharing this document, then this is the impact. Well, we do know. Also, yeah, that's more, for example, on the labeling side, I label my files like every file. But I don't expect others to do that. If I don't let them be aware of it, that they are just doing their job, and it's not their job to be aware all the time of how the information flows. So we have to help them because we cannot expect them to be aware all of the time. It's not their daily job.
Yeah.
And maybe, sorry, go for it, Anna.
Sorry, I think that's such a good point because I think both the examples you guys brought up really brings up the fact that security and productivity, we always need to find a balance, and it's one of the toughest things that I've found in my role is finding a good balance between security and productivity, and it looks different within any organization, any group within an organization that you go to. So constant challenge, but worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say to Justine's point earlier, maybe agents could help, right? Maybe eventually the agent would be the one talking to the user and could kind of help them, identify why this document, like maybe before sharing, an agent could kind of like interrupt you or something, right? I don't know, like a bouncer at a club kind of thing, like, hey, you need to show me your ID. It could be like, hey, are you sure you want to share this document? It actually contains XYZ, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just
That's
thinking out
really
loud.
nice. Like we do now
Yeah.
have DLP, right? That we can do a
Yeah.
pop-up or a notification. But if you actually have your agent that has his eyes and ears open all the whole time and helps you, that would be great. So I guess we have to wrap up because it's already we've been talking for almost an hour.
It's gone quick.
Yeah, maybe one more last question. I don't know how you are in the time, Anna, but like the last question I would like to ask is, what is a recent development that you found really interesting about data oversharing, or maybe e-discovery or audit? Just one.
Recent development. I think probably the Graph API audit log that I mentioned, right?
Yeah.
The fact that they've now introduced granular permissions per workload, it clearly shows that Microsoft are really adopting a least privilege perspective
Yeah.
from even just a visibility of logs, which you could argue everyone, like there's no harm in seeing logs, right? But sometimes logs could tip off people to sensitive behavior, or if they're being investigated and then they stumble on their own logs, or they stumble on them being a kind of a recipient of the log where they've been in an e-discovery case or something like that, it could make them worried to say, hey, why is HR like doing an e-discovery on me, right? So I think granularly breaking down those audit log permissions through Graph is a great first step, but I also think Graph is a very like maturity item as well. I don't know how many companies have awareness of Graph. I had to learn Graph over the last few years. I wasn't aware of it prior to that. And it's definitely a maturity thing. So I think maybe next step could be for Microsoft to enhance the existing Purview roles like Audit Reader, maybe have like a flag within that to say, do you want these workloads or untick tick workloads? Then you could have Purview Audit Reader for OneDrive, Purview Audit Reader for Exchange, etc. But
Yeah.
I think just seeing that granular audit log permissions in Graph was definitely a good recent development for me, fairly recent.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Nice. Well, thank you for sharing so much with us. I really loved
Oversharing,
it.
right?
Yeah, no, I really loved
Yeah.
it. So thank you for sharing all your knowledge.